My name is Maria Santos, and I'm sitting in my car outside Houston Methodist Hospital at the end of another 12-hour nursing shift, staring at my phone screen, showing 17 missed calls from my sister Carmen in Manila, knowing that each unanswered ring represents another moment I've chosen my American career over my Filipino family's desperate need for my presence. At 34, I've achieved everything I dreamed of when I left the Philippines 12 years ago. I'm a registered nurse making more money than my parents ever imagined. I own a house in a nice neighborhood, and I've built a successful American life that was supposed to justify the sacrifice of leaving everyone I love behind. But today, as I finally gather the courage to return Carmen's calls, I know she's going to tell me that our mother's cancer has progressed beyond treatment, and that once again, I'm going to be thousands of miles away when my family needs me most. I immigrated to America in 2012 when I was 22, fresh out of nursing school in Cebu City with a head full of dreams and a heart heavy with the weight of my family's expectations. I was the eldest of 4 children, the one designated since childhood as the family's hope for financial salvation through overseas employment. My parents, Roberto and Luz Santos, had spent their life savings paying for my nursing education with the understanding that I would eventually work abroad and send money home to support them, my 3 younger siblings, and my aging grandmother who lived in our crowded house in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were limited and poverty was a constant threat. The decision to leave wasn't really a choice. It was a family obligation that had been planned since I was in high school. In the Philippines, nursing is often seen as a ticket to overseas employment rather than a calling to serve patients, and thousands of young Filipinos study nursing specifically to qualify for work visas in America, Canada, and other wealthy countries where healthcare workers are in demand. My parents made enormous sacrifices to pay for my education, borrowing money from relatives and working multiple jobs to cover tuition, books, and living expenses while I studied. The implicit contract was clear. I would use my American nursing salary to lift our family out of poverty and provide opportunities for my younger siblings that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The immigration process was lengthy and complicated, requiring me to pass American nursing board exams, obtain proper visas, and find a hospital willing to sponsor my employment. I spent 2 years working in a Manila hospital while preparing for the journey to America, living at home, and contributing my small Filipino salary to family expenses while studying English and American healthcare practices during my free time. When I finally received approval to work at Houston Methodist, the entire family celebrated as if I had won the lottery, which in many ways I had. The early years in Houston were simultaneously exhilarating and heartbreaking. I was earning more money in a month than my father made in a year as a jeepney driver in Cebu, and I was able to send substantial remittances home that immediately improved my family's living conditions. Within 6 months, they had moved to a better neighborhood, my siblings were attending private schools, and my parents could afford medical care that had been financially impossible before my immigration. The success felt incredible, but it came with a cost that I hadn't fully anticipated: the complete absence from every significant moment in my family's life. I missed my younger brother Miguel's high school graduation, my sister Carmen's wedding, and my grandmother's 70th birthday celebration. I experienced these milestones through grainy video calls and photos sent by messaging apps, always feeling like an observer of my own family's life rather than an active participant. The time zone difference meant that I was often working during their important moments or sleeping when they needed to share their experiences with me. Our relationship became increasingly mediated by technology and money transfers rather than physical presence and shared experiences. The guilt began as a manageable ache that I told myself was the normal price of building a better future for everyone. But as months turned into years, and I continued to miss funeral, graduations, birthdays, and everyday family interactions, the emotional cost became overwhelming. I would send money for my cousin's quinceañera, but couldn't attend the celebration. I paid for my father's heart medication, but couldn't hold his hand during his cardiac episodes. I funded my siblings' college educations, but couldn't offer emotional support during their academic struggles and personal crises. The breaking point came 3 years ago when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I faced the impossible choice between taking extended leave from my American job to care for her during treatment or continuing to work to pay for her medical expenses. The Filipino healthcare system, while improving, still required significant out-of-pocket payments for quality cancer treatment, and my nursing salary in Houston could cover costs that would have been impossible for my family to afford otherwise. I chose to stay in America and work overtime to fund her treatment, hiring private nurses and paying for the best oncology care available in Manila. The decision felt logical and practical, but it was emotionally devastating. I was saving my mother's life through my financial contributions while simultaneously abandoning her emotionally during the most frightening experience of her life. She underwent chemotherapy and radiation treatments with Carmen and Miguel by her side, while I participated through video calls that showed me her increasing frailty but didn't allow me to provide physical comfort, cook her favorite foods, or simply be present during the long, frightening hours between treatments. The guilt intensified when my father suffered a stroke 6 months after my mother's cancer diagnosis, leaving him partially paralyzed and requiring extensive rehabilitation and care. Again, I found myself in the position of being the primary financial supporter for his medical treatment while being physically absent during his recovery process. I paid for physical therapy, medications, and home healthcare services, but I couldn't help him relearn basic functions or provide the emotional support that only a daughter's presence could offer. My mental health began deteriorating under the weight of guilt, financial pressure, and emotional isolation. I was working overtime shifts constantly to maximize my income for family medical expenses, leaving me exhausted and stressed. I had no social life in Houston because I spent all my free time on video calls with my family or working extra hours to earn money for their needs. I developed anxiety and depression symptoms that I tried to hide from both my American colleagues and my Filipino family, not wanting to burden anyone with my emotional struggles. The isolation was compounded by the fact that my Filipino friends in Houston were dealing with similar guilt and family pressures, making it difficult to find emotional support or perspective on my situation. We would share stories about missed family events and financial obligations, but rather than providing comfort, these conversations often reinforced the sense that this was just the unavoidable reality of overseas Filipino worker life. The guilt felt normal and universal, which made it seem permanent and unchangeable. The crisis reached its peak last year when my mother's cancer returned with a vengeance, and the doctors in Manila told us that treatment options were limited and she likely had only months to live. I finally took a leave of absence from work and returned to the Philippines for the first time in 8 years, expecting to spend my mother's final weeks providing the care and presence that I had been unable to offer during her illness. The reunion was heartbreaking in ways I hadn't prepared for. My mother had aged dramatically during my absence, not just from cancer but from the stress of managing family crises without her eldest daughter's physical support. My father, still recovering from his stroke, had become dependent on my younger siblings in ways that reversed traditional family roles and created stress for everyone. My siblings, who had graduated college and started careers using my financial support, were struggling to balance their own adult responsibilities with caring for aging parents and managing the emotional burden of my absence. Most painful was the realization that my physical presence, which I had been saving for this crucial moment, couldn't immediately restore the emotional connections that had been weakened by years of long-distance relationships. My mother was grateful to have me home, but we had to rebuild intimacy and communication patterns that had been interrupted by years of separation. My siblings, while loving, had developed family dynamics that functioned around my absence, and my return temporarily disrupted systems they had created to cope with my physical unavailability. I spent 3 months in the Philippines, using all my accumulated vacation time and savings to be present for my mother's final treatment attempts and to reconnect with my family. The experience was simultaneously healing and heartbreaking, as I realized both how much my presence meant to them and how much irreplaceable time had been lost during my years of prioritizing financial over emotional support. My mother passed away peacefully with all her children by her bedside, but I carried enormous guilt about the 8 years of her life that I had missed while building my American career. Returning to Houston after my mother's funeral felt like emotional whiplash. I had to immediately resume my nursing duties while processing grief and guilt and isolation, far from the family members who shared my loss and could provide mutual support during mourning. The hospital was understanding about my bereavement leave, but American workplace culture didn't account for the extended grief processing that Filipino culture considers normal and necessary after losing a parent. The guilt evolved into a more complex form of survivor's guilt mixed with regret about choices that couldn't be undone. I had succeeded in providing financial security for my family and had been able to afford quality medical care for both parents, but I had missed most of the daily moments that create family bonds and provide emotional support during crises. My success felt hollow because it had come at the cost of presence during the most important years of my parents' lives. The healing process began when I started working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in working with immigrant families and understood the unique challenges faced by overseas Filipino workers. She helped me understand that my guilt, while intense and painful, was a normal response to the impossible choices that immigration often requires. You were faced with choosing between your family's financial survival and your emotional presence, she explained. There was no perfect choice, and carrying guilt about the choice you made doesn't honor your mother's sacrifice or your father's ongoing needs. Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to the concept of ambiguous loss, which describes the grief experienced when loved ones are physically absent but psychologically present, or vice versa. My relationship with my family had involved years of ambiguous loss. They were present in my thoughts and concerns every day, but absent from my physical experience. Understanding this concept helped me recognize that my grief was legitimate and that the guilt I felt was a common response to immigration-related family separation. Through therapy, I also began to understand that my financial contributions had been a form of love and care, even though they couldn't replace physical presence. My mother's cancer treatment had been successful for several years because of my financial support, giving our family precious additional time together that wouldn't have been possible without my overseas employment. My father's stroke recovery had been more complete because I could afford quality rehabilitation services. My siblings had educational and career opportunities that were only possible because of my sacrifice. I started reframing my immigration experience not as abandonment of family responsibility, but as a different form of family service that required enormous personal sacrifice. I had given up daily family relationships, missed crucial milestones, and lived in emotional isolation for years in order to provide financial security that dramatically improved my family's quality of life and opportunities. The guilt I felt was evidence of how much I loved them, not evidence that I had failed them. The perspective shift allowed me to begin rebuilding my relationship with my surviving family members from a place of connection rather than guilt. I started making regular video calls with my father, not just to check on his health, but to share daily experiences and maintain emotional intimacy despite physical distance. I became more involved in my siblings' lives, offering emotional support and guidance rather than just financial assistance. I began planning regular trips to the Philippines, budgeting for annual visits that would allow me to maintain relationships while continuing to work in America. I also started building a more sustainable life in Houston that included social relationships and personal interests rather than just work and family obligations. I joined a Filipino-American professional association where I met other immigrants who had navigated similar challenges and found ways to balance career success with family relationships. I started dating and developing friendships that weren't centered around work or family guilt, creating a support network that could help me process ongoing immigration challenges. The relationship with my father has become deeper and more meaningful than it was before my mother's death, partly because we both understand the preciousness of time and the importance of emotional connection despite physical distance. He's proud of my professional success and grateful for the financial security I provide, but he also expresses his love and concern for my emotional well-being in ways that help me feel valued as a daughter rather than just as a financial resource. My siblings and I have developed better communication patterns that include regular family video calls, shared planning for my father's care, and more equitable distribution of family responsibilities. They've taken on more of the daily caregiving tasks while I continue to provide financial support, creating a system that allows everyone to contribute according to their abilities and circumstances. I'm no longer carrying the entire burden of family welfare alone. I've also become involved in supporting other Filipino nurses who are navigating similar challenges with family separation and guilt. I volunteer with organizations that provide mental health resources for overseas Filipino workers and speak at conferences about the emotional costs of immigration that aren't often discussed in conversations about overseas employment success. Many of the nurses I mentor express relief at hearing that their guilt and grief are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. The financial planning I've done for my father's ongoing care and my siblings' futures has created more sustainable systems that don't require me to work constantly or sacrifice my own mental health for family obligations. I've purchased insurance policies, set up investment accounts, and created emergency funds that provide security for my family while also allowing me to have more balanced work schedules and personal time for self-care. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. The Filipino-American Mental Health Initiative provides culturally competent therapy services for overseas Filipino workers dealing with family separation, guilt, and immigration-related depression. Support groups for overseas Filipino workers offer peer connections and shared strategies for managing family obligations while maintaining personal mental health. Financial planning services specializing in remittance strategies help Filipino Americans create sustainable systems for supporting families abroad without sacrificing their own financial security. Grief counseling services that understand cultural differences in mourning and family obligations provide appropriate support for processing loss while living far from extended family support systems. Professional associations for Filipino American healthcare workers offer networking, mentorship, and advocacy around workplace issues that affect immigrants with family obligations abroad. Travel planning services that specialize in Philippines-US connections help families coordinate visits and maximize time together during limited vacation periods. Legal services for immigration and family reunification help Filipino Americans understand options for bringing family members to America or facilitating easier travel between countries. Cultural competency training for American employers helps workplaces better understand and accommodate the unique challenges faced by Filipino workers with overseas family responsibilities. Today, when I meet other Filipino Americans who are struggling with guilt about leaving family behind, I tell them that immigration requires impossible choices and that carrying guilt doesn't honor the sacrifices made by everyone involved. Your presence abroad creates opportunities for your family that justify the emotional costs, but you also have the right to build a life that includes personal happiness and relationships. The goal is finding sustainable ways to support your family while also taking care of your own mental health and emotional needs, recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup forever.